In this lecture, we're going to see how we can use capture lists in our Lambda functions and do some useful things. We have seen that the syntax of our Lambda functions includes these angle brackets here, but we haven't really used them to do anything. For what we have done in the last lecture, they were empty all the time. In this lecture, we're going to use them. Here is a simple example of how we can use our capture list. We have two variables, a and b. They are of double type and they contain these values 10 and 20. But sometimes we want to use things outside the scope of the Lambda function inside the Lambda function here. And if you set up your Lambda function with an empty capture list, suppose you don't have these two guys in, and you try to use a and b like this, you're going to get a compiler error because the body of the Lambda function doesn't have access to the outer context here. It can only use things inside the Lambda functions or things that you pass to the Lambda function here. But it can't directly access things outside the Lambda functions. And we can have access to things that are declared and defined outside the Lambda function through our capture list. If you look here, we are saying a and b, and this is the syntax we have to capture these two variables, a and b, and have access to them inside our Lambda function here. And this is what capture lists are really for, giving you access to things that are declared outside the scope of the Lambda function. Because if you really think about it, this Lambda function thing we have here is really a type. So it is its own thing that has these behaviors built in so that we can call it and do things, but it doesn't really have direct access to the outside where it was declared. And you have to give it access through the capture mechanism here. Okay, now that you know this, we're going to see different ways we can use the capture mechanism. One thing we can do is capture by value. And if we capture by value, what we're going to have inside the Lambda function is going to be a copy. Suppose we have a variable here, which is c. The value is going to be 42, as you see here. We're going to set up a Lambda function and capture our c variable by value in this Lambda function here. And what we're going to do outside the Lambda function, notice the Lambda function has a handle, so we can call it. We're going to loop 5 times. And at each iteration, we're going to call our Lambda function and print the inner value here. But after that, we're going to increment our c variable, and this is going to increment the outer variable here. And what we want to see is that the changes we are doing on the outside here are picked up by the inner value that we have in our Lambda function here. And I hate to break it to you, this is going to not be the case, because what we have inside the Lambda function is a copy of the outside variable here. So what we're going to have is for the outer value to go from 42 all the way to 47, we're going to go 5 times incrementing this little guy, but the thing on the inside is not going to change because it is a copy. The incrementation here is affecting the outside variable here, but it is not affecting the copy we have inside our Lambda function. So for all these loops here, we're going to see 42 printed out. And we're going to see this in a minute when we hit Visual Studio Code. Let's say 42 correctly. Excuse my typing here. Okay, so now you know that we can capture by value and you know what this really means. Another thing we can do is capture by reference. And the syntax to do that is to add an ampersand symbol in front of the variable that we capture here. And if we do this and run the same code we run in the last lecture, we're going to see now that the changes we do on the outside are going to be picked up by the inner side of our Lambda function because we are capturing by reference. What we have inside our Lambda function here is a true reference to the outside variable here. And we're going to see that now the outside and the inside are going to be incrementing together, and we're going to have 43, 42, 44, and things like that printed out on the console. Okay, this is really all I have to share with you in this lecture, showing you how you can use your capture list and that you can capture either by value or by reference. We're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is capture lists. We're going to grab our template files pretty quick and we're going to put them in place. We're going to put them in the current project. And we're going to open this guy in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping in place here. And we're going to open our main CPP file, clean it up a little bit, and close the left pane here. What we want to do in here is learn a little more about capture lists. And we're going to put in a piece of code to play with just that. We have two variables, a and 10 here. And we have our Lambda function set up. And let's take out our capture lists, so that you can see the compiler error we see if we try to use them as is here. So we have our two variables and we have a Lambda function set up here. And inside the Lambda function, notice that we are trying to access variables that have been declared on the outside of the Lambda function here. And by default, if we try to do this, we're going to get a compiler error because these two variables don't exist in the scope of the Lambda function here. Let's bring up a terminal and see what Visual Studio Code is saying about this. And it is going to say an enclosing function local variable cannot be referenced in a Lambda body unless it is in the capture list. And you see that this is really descriptive. Okay, we have seen this error, but we want to see what the compiler says about this. We're going to pass this through GCC and we should get a similar error. It is going to say A is not captured, and it is going to go down here and say B is not captured here. And this is the error. We are trying to use outside variables in our Lambda function, but to really do that, we need to capture A and B. And the syntax to capture our variables is to put them inside our angle brackets here with a comma separated list of the variables that we want to capture. So we're going to say A, comma B, because that's what we want to capture here. And the moment we do that, Visual Studio Code should be happy. It is not happy. I think we need to compile this for it to be happy. So let's do that. And you see now our variables are being captured and we are summing them up and we are printing the result of adding them up here by calling the function through a handle we have set up here. Hopefully this is really making sense. Let's build the program again. So let's use the GCC. You're going to see that the build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. We should see A plus B is 30, but the values are getting inside the Lambda function through our capture list. They are not going through the parameter list here. This is really something you need to be aware of. Now that you know how capture lists work, let's see that you can capture either by value or by reference. And we're going to see what that means exactly. I am going to go down here and put in a piece of code to play with capturing by value. Okay, let's do that. We have a variable called C. The value is 42. And we set up a Lambda function which is going to capture C with this syntax here. And this is the default syntax we saw like we did on top here. So we are going to be capturing like this, and if we do this, we're going to be capturing by value. The meaning of that is that what we have inside our Lambda function is not going to be the original value here. It is going to be a copy of what we have there. What we can do here is use this thing in a loop and really prove this. So we're going to loop 5 times from 0 all the way to 4, because this is going to go until I is no longer less than 5. And inside, we're going to print the outer value, which is going to be the C here. After that, we're going to call our Lambda function, which is going to print the inner value in the Lambda function. And we're going to see that the incrementation we do on the outside, which is going to affect the outer value here, is going to be visible inside the Lambda function here. And that's not going to be the case. The change we do here is not going to be picked up by the Lambda function here, because what we have inside is a copy. So what we're going to see is for the outer value to go from 42, 43, 43, 45, and it is going to go until we hit the end of this loop here. But the inside value is not going to change because the change we do in here is not going to affect the copy that we have in our Lambda function here. Hopefully this makes sense. And again, if you have a problem, please make sure you ask through the course platform, and I will do the best I can to help you out. For now, we're going to build and run this program. You see the bold is good, so let's clear and run Rooster. You're going to see outer value is 43, outer value is 43, outer value is 44, outer value is 45. The outer value is changing, but the inner value is staying at 42, as you see here. Hopefully this proves that the outer value and the inner value are two different things. But we can even go further and print the addresses of the outer value and the inner value. Let's do that. We're going to add that to our statement here and say the address of this guy. So we're going to say address of outer value, or say address of inner value. We can say it like that to really be descriptive in our terminal here. So we're going to say the address of C, and on the outer value, we're going to add another piece of information and say address of outer value, and we're going to say the address of C. And this is going to pick up the outer value that we have here, and this is going to use the inner value we have in our Lambda function here. Let's try and build, and hopefully these two addresses, the inner and outer addresses, are going to be different. That's what we want to see here, and really proving that what we have inside the Lambda function is a copy through the capture mechanism. So let's run the program. The build was good. So the outer value, the address is DE4. The inner value, the address is DE0. We are proving that what we have inside our Lambda function is really a copy. So this is how you can capture by value, and that's going to make a copy. But sometimes you really want to capture by reference, and we're going to see how you can do that. So we're going to comment out the code to capture by value here. We're going to grab the code and reuse it because that's going to be very similar to what we had before. We're going to say capture by reference. We're going to put in our code and we're going to change it a tiny bit. What we're going to do is add an ampersand symbol in front of our variable here that we are capturing. And we're going to say ampersand. The moment we do this, what we have inside the Lambda function is no longer a copy. It's going to be a true reference to the outer value here. And now the changes we do to our outer value are going to be visible inside the Lambda function here. And you're going to see the addresses to be the same. Let's build and really see this. We're going to use GCC to build our program. The build is good. We can clear now and run Rooster. And we're going to see that the outer value, let's make sure we have some spaces after these guys, and let's go up and do that and build again because things are really cramped together and I don't like this. So the build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. So we're going to see the outer value and the inner value are changing together, and the addresses are now the same because we have captured by reference. The inner value and the outer value are referencing the same variable we have outside here. This is really all we set out to do in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. The main idea was the capture mechanism we have with our Lambda functions to capture things outside the context of Lambda functions. We can capture by specifying a comma-separated list of the variables that we want to capture, and we have the option to either capture by value by using the variable directly in the capture list like we do here, or by prepending an ampersand symbol here and capture by reference. And you are going to have to choose whichever way you want to capture your variables now that you know about all these options here. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to see how we can capture everything from the outside context to the Lambda function. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.